The bombshell Russia story. The New York Times reports the FBI opened an investigation into whether the sitting president was secretly working for Russia against the United States. At the heart of the probe, Mr. Trump's firing of FBI Director James Comey and evidence that he linked it to the Russia investigation.
I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse.
The president responds by harshly criticizing Comey and other FBI leaders. We'll have New York Times reporter Michael Schmidt and NBC News legal analyst Ben Wittes on what this could mean for the Mueller investigation going forward. And joining me for insight and analysis are Democratic pollster Cornell Belcher, Peggy Noonan, columnist for the Wall Street Journal, Republican strategist Al Cardenas, and NBC News national political reporter Carol Lee. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history. This is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Good Sunday morning. We have two stories that are driving this day. The first, that explosive story posted by the New York Times on Friday night, that in 2017, the FBI opened an investigation into whether President Trump was working as a Russian asset as the sitting president against interests of the United States. The investigation was opened after Mr. Trump fired FBI Director James Comey because he mentioned the Russia investigation in his dismissal letter to Comey, and because the president told my colleague Lester Holt that he fired Comey in part because of the Russia investigation. Now, it's important to note that the Times says no evidence has emerged publicly that Mr. Trump was in fact working with the Russians when he fired Mr. Comey. The second big story, of course, is this government shutdown, now in its 23rd day and now officially the longest ever. What we're seeing is not so much the consequences of divided government, which voters generally say they like because each party acts as a brake on the other. No, what we're seeing are the consequences of a polarized government, with two parties that often don't talk to each other, sometimes can't talk to each other, and right now may not want to talk to each other. And caught in the middle, some 800,000 federal employees who are out of work and not currently getting paid. That has actually led some in Washington to hope President Trump follows through on his constitutionally questionable threat and declare a national emergency as a face-saving way out of this mess. If he does, this would be a national emergency designed to solve his own political emergency.
Shutting down the government is not governing.
For President Trump, the focus on a wall and the symbol it represents to his supporters may be the political crisis he needs to deflect focus from his own legal jeopardy.
They can name it whatever they can name it, peaches. I don't care what they name it, but we need money for that barrier.
But ultimately, the shutdown leaves the president boxed in and weakens him for the fights ahead. Mr. Trump responded to the Times story about the FBI's counterintelligence investigation, tweeting that it was opened for no reason and with no proof, and attacking James Comey as a total sleaze.
Are you now, or have you ever worked for Russia, Mr. President?
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written. And if you read the article, you'd see that they found absolutely nothing.
The president's mounting legal problems are the backdrop to the shutdown stalemate. Mr. Trump and Democrats are both dug in, with no end in sight.
I don't want to give an easy way out of something as simple as this.
I'm a mother of 5, grandmother of 9. I know a temper tantrum when I see one.
After floating the idea of a, quote, national emergency,
If we don't make a deal, I would say it would be very surprising to me that I would not declare a national emergency.
On Friday, the president said he is not planning to declare one after all.
I have the absolute right to do it, but I'm not going to do it so fast.
We need to have an end game. If the end game is an emergency declaration by the president, do it now.
But most Republicans panned the idea.
Tomorrow, the national security emergency might be, climate change. So let's seize fossil fuel plants or something.
Democrats also see no incentive to negotiate.
Let's put all of this in context, right? The president at this point is holding the American people hostage over his vanity project.
Most Republicans are standing with the president for now.
It is laughable to think that you can seal a 1,900-mile border without some sort of barrier.
But the shutdown is already causing pain.
We want to work. We're not pawns. We're not bargaining chips. We're people.
Including for Mr. Trump's own voters.
I'm starting to get scared. I've been a Trump supporter. I think he's done a lot of wonderful things. but this is not one of them.
One White House advisor appeared to compare the shutdown for furloughed workers to a vacation.
We have a shutdown, and so they can't go to work, and so then they have the vacation, but they don't have to use their vacation days. And then they come back, and then they get their back pay, then they're, in some sense, they're better off.
And joining me now from Houston is Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Senator Cruz, welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Chuck, always good to be with you.
Let me start with the fact that you're in Houston and not here. And you're not the only one. I'll have Senator Kaine on. He's coming to me from Richmond and not here. Why isn't the United States Senate here, sir?
Well, it's very simple. I'm here over the weekend as most senators go home to the state and come home during the weekend. I came back to Texas on Thursday to travel with the president to go down to the border. And so working down here, meeting with stakeholders on the border, meeting with Border Patrol agents, meeting with ICE officials, meeting with families who've had family members murdered by criminal illegal aliens. And so I'm down here doing my job. I'll be back in Washington on Monday. I hope on Monday what we'll see is finally Washington coming together and opening up the government. What that's going to take is for the Democrats to move off the position that they've been taking so far of no compromise, no movement. Their extreme position, they've got to be willing to give in on.
Does the president, though, need to move? He hasn't moved at all publicly, and it's not clear what the offers are it's other than concrete to steel.
Chuck, that's actually not accurate. The president has said over and over again, I've been in the room when he said it, that he's more than willing to compromise. He's more than willing to meet in the middle. The reason we have a shutdown is, let's go back to December. In December, the then Republican House passed funding for the entire federal government. It included $5.7 billion for an additional 234 miles of steel barrier. When it got to the Senate, Chuck Schumer and the Democrats filibustered that bill. Every Democrat said, no, we will not allow the government to be funded so long as they're building even a single mile of barrier. That's why we have a shutdown, and that's not a reasonable position. And the president's position has been, he's perfectly happy to negotiate, to compromise. Yeah. He said many times, doesn't have to be $5.7 billion. He could find some other number, but the Democrats have said no. The only thing they're willing to consider is 0, 0, 0. That is not reasonable, and that's why we have a shutdown.
Senator, you yourself, I think in 2017, you were lamenting the fact that here you had all Republican control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, and things weren't moving very quickly. He didn't make his case for a wall. He didn't plow the field over those 2 years to try to make this work, and he tried to jam it in at the last minute. Isn't this on the president for his lack of being able to get congressional Republicans to come together much earlier?
I don't think that's true at all. I don't think it's the president's fault that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are being political. If you look at the 2 years we had Republican control of both houses, we saw incredible forward progress. We saw an historic tax cut. We're seeing booming economic results. We've got the lowest African-American unemployment that has ever been recorded, the lowest Hispanic unemployment that's ever been recorded.
But my question was about the immigration issue. He didn't.
All right, let's take it.
He didn't do anything to try to actually get Republicans united on this, and he jammed it through at the last minute.
Well, but that's not actually right. You remember the fairly remarkable Oval Office meeting between Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the president. And Nancy Pelosi said then, she said, Mr. President, you can't pass this in the House. She basically said, I dare you. You don't have the votes. He said, yes, I do. And she said, no, you don't. I dare you. So he turned around, he took it to the House, which was Republican, and they passed it. And Chuck, here's the ridiculous thing about the position of Senate Democrats. This is not substantive. They voted for it before. Chuck Schumer and every single Democrat in the Senate in 2013 voted for 350 miles of additional border fencing and border security. Yeah. They've now shut the government down on 234 miles. And so I think an awful lot of people are asking, well, if you voted for 350 miles, why would you force a shutdown on 234? That is not reasonable, and the president remains willing to come together and compromise. But so far, the Democrats don't want to do that.
Why not open up the government and just and move the Homeland Security debate to the side and debate that while you pay government workers?
Well, the House passed a bill opening the government, funding all of the government, and securing the border. And the Democrats' position can't be, we've got to force a shutdown.
Right.
We're going to hold, what the Democrats are saying is we're going to hold federal workers hostage. And you know, let me note, you've got my friend Tim Kaine coming on in a minute. He represents Virginia. There are a lot of federal workers in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If Tim Kaine and Mark Warner were to say, we're going to put the jobs of the men and women of Virginia ahead of our partisan interest, ahead of the fact that our base hates Donald Trump. Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, it would take only 5 more Democrats in the Senate to have the votes to say, this second Schumer shutdown is over. We're reopening the government, and we're going to implement common sense border security that the American people want.
And I think they would say the same thing about you and your fellow Republicans of the political base. I think that's why we're in this stalemate. I want to move to another topic here. Let me ask you this. This morning,
let me say something on that point, Chuck. There is a difference between one side, the Democrats, who are saying, we will not move, we will not compromise, we will not negotiate, and the other side, the president, who is saying, I'm happy to negotiate, and what he's proposing, the Democrats have already voted for. They're playing politics because they hate Trump, and that's not a good enough reason for Chuck Schumer and the Democrats to shut down the government.
Let me ask you this. The New York Times reported on Friday night that the FBI, after the Comey firing, because of what the president said, both in a letter to Mr. Comey and to my colleague Lester Holt, they opened up a counterintelligence investigation concerned that a sitting president was working on behalf of a foreign agent. How much of a concern is this to you?
Well, I don't know the details of the specifics there. I know what was reported publicly in the media. And I sit on the Senate Judiciary Committee, so we will consider any allegations that come forward. But I'll tell you, Chuck, something that is really interesting. You and I all work in Washington, but I also come back to Texas just about every week. I'm back outside the Beltway. There is an incredible divide between Washington and the rest of the country when it comes to Bob Mueller and the Russia investigation. The mainstream media, Washington is obsessed with it. And when you get outside the Beltway, I don't find anybody concerned with this at all. They're concerned with jobs, lower taxes, higher wages, more opportunity. They're concerned with securing the border. So the questions I get are not about the latest obsession and allegations about Russia, Russia, Russia. They're about, hey, when are we actually going to secure the border? When are we going to keep making this country safer? So that's going to stay my focus. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, I'll consider whatever evidence is produced, but I'm not going to base it on unsubstantiated media reports.
How about on the Foreign Relations Committee? The Washington Post is reporting that the president basically is not sharing what he discusses with Vladimir Putin behind closed doors. Do you think you guys in the Senate ought to, for instance, subpoena a translator so that you have a real readout of what the president and Vladimir Putin are saying to each other?
You know, I think it's premature for that. I've seen the allegations. I want to find out a little bit more about what happened there. I want to learn more than just the allegations in the press. Listen, I will say, if you compare objectively President Trump's policies to Russia compared to President Obama's policies to Russia, by any measure, President Obama was much easier, was much more gentle on Russia. You and I both recall Obama leaning over on a hot mic and saying just before the 2012 election, tell Vladimir I'll have a lot more flexibility after the election. Now, they weren't keeping notes. It just happened to be a network had a camera going. If you compare substance, for example, Trump went to NATO and urged the Europeans, don't let the Russians build a pipeline through Europe. You want to talk about what actually makes a difference standing up to Russia? That on policy was far, far more important than much of the weakness and appeasement we saw under Obama.
And finally, before I let you go, I want to get you to comment on your colleague Tim Scott's op-ed in the Washington Post about Steve King, Iowa congressman who was your national co-chair for president. He writes this: some in our party wonder why Republicans are constantly accused of racism. Well, it is because of our silence when things like this are said. King's comments are not conservative views, but separate views that should be ridiculed at every turn possible. He questioned in a New York Times interview why we find phrases like white nationalism to somehow be offensive. Where are you on this, sir?
Well, listen, Tim is a good man and a good friend. He and I worked together on many, many issues. What Steve King said was stupid. It was stupid, it was hurtful, it was wrong, and he needs to stop it. I think all of us ought to be united, regardless of party, in saying white supremacism, white nationalism is hatred, it is bigotry, it is evil, it is wrong. And I think we need that clarity, and I'm certainly going to urge everyone to provide that clarity.
Are you going to support him in the future?
You know, what I'm going to do is urge everyone to stand for principles that matter.
Okay.
You know, this same weekend in Texas, there was a movement from some activists that asked to remove a local official in Fort Worth who was a Muslim. I spoke out actively because it was my home state. I spoke actively against that. I said, listen, we believe in religious freedom. We believe in free speech. We believe in diversity. And ultimately, the voters in the Tarrant County GOP did the right thing. They didn't remove that official. So I'm going to speak out and engage. And when it comes to speaking out against bigotry, whether it is the Klan or Nazis or anything else, I have a lifetime of standing up to that bigotry, and I'll continue it.
Senator Cruz, Republican from Texas, appreciate you coming on and sharing your views this morning. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chuck.
And joining me now from the other side of the aisle and from Richmond is Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. Welcome back to Meet the Press. And Senator, I'm going to start with this. Why are you guys not here? Okay, why aren't you in Washington this weekend trying to force a way to open up this government?
Well, Chuck, we are trying to work a deal over the weekend to open the government, but I'll tell you why we're not here. I objected to adjourning in the Senate on Thursday because I have been talking to all these victims of the Trump shutdown. It was President Trump who said he would be proud to shut down the government, that it would be on him. He's done that, and people are hurting, worried about missing mortgage payments, having to reschedule medical appointments. So I objected to the adjournment on Thursday, which is very, very rare. And then I ended up working a deal with the majority leader where we would be in Friday, the day on which people missed their paychecks, the day on which the shutdown became tied for the longest ever, and the Republicans agreed to fast track and pass my guarantee of back pay. I was a co-sponsor of a bill to guarantee back pay for every federal worker. We got it passed unanimously in the Senate. President Trump has agreed to sign it. The House passed it Friday morning. So I think we should be in, but I was able to get the Senate and the House to act to protect our federal employees. And I've been on the phone all day yesterday, and I'm going to be on the phone today with Republican colleagues trying to find that path so we can reopen government.
Is it time to give the president something here? Let me put up a quote here from the Virginia delegation, Abigail Spanberger, who just won from a district that President Trump carried, and she said this: if I am getting comments and contact from my constituents expressing concern that the Democrats are not prioritizing security, then I think we can do better. She's obviously concerned that it looks like the Democrats aren't for any border security. Do Democrats have to meet the president somewhere north of where they are now?
Chuck, the willingness of Democrats to invest billions of dollars in border security is not in doubt. In 2013, we did a bill in the Senate that Ted Cruz voted against that was going to invest $40+ billion over 10 years. Cruz voted against it. House Republicans killed it. Democrats support border security. In February of this year, we took a deal to the president, $25 billion in border security. 46 out of 49 Dems voted for it. Senator Cruz voted against it. President Trump killed the deal. At the end of December, we reached a deal with the Republicans, ample border security funding that they supported in committee and on the floor. We supported it just 3 weeks ago. But when President Trump put out a tweet suggesting he didn't like it, now Republicans have fled for the hills. Democrats invest over and over and over again in border security. Just this week, Republicans, led by Lindsey Graham, tried to negotiate a deal of border security, and President Trump blew up the negotiations. This is a guy who has prayed for a shutdown. And get this, Chuck, who is he injuring? We've got 13,000 FBI agents, more than 10,000 Bureau of prison guards, air traffic controllers, Coast Guard folks who interdict drugs, all of them working without pay because of this president's shutdown, and yet he says he cares about national security when he's taking paychecks away from hardworking public safety professionals? It makes no sense. All that has to happen is the Republicans have to be willing to vote the way they did just 3 weeks ago, open up government, and then we'll dialogue about border security.
It does sound like, though, you're willing to support some fencing, barriers, if they call it something else, if it reopens the government.
I will say this, we first should reopen government. Why punish people who are applying for food stamps because the president is having a temper tantrum? Open government first, but Democrats have always been willing to invest in border security. Chuck, all we want to do is make sure that it's spent the right way. Drugs come in through ports of entry. Let's beef up ports of entry. The biggest group of undocumented people in the country come in on legal visas and overstay. If you build a 1,000,000-foot wall, it won't deal with that problem. What we don't want to do is waste taxpayer money on a vanity project that's ineffective that the president said Mexico would pay for, but spending massive amounts on border security to keep us safe. Dems do it over and over again, and it's been Republicans that have been blocking it.
Senator, on the campaign trail in 2016, you spent the last 2 months regularly questioning the president, at that time, candidate Donald Trump's ties to Vladimir Putin, complimentary ways he talked about things. So you have those questions that you had as a candidate. Now you have this story in the New York Times that has the FBI worried that the president acted on Comey at the behest of the Russian government. What does that tell you where things are now? Does that mean that Democrats should be looking at actually beginning impeachment proceedings? Or is this something you think let the Mueller probe go first? How much more do you need to know?
We've got to protect the Mueller investigation. You're right, I was very worried about this, in 2016 because the president took a public stage in July and encouraged Russia to cyber hack the election at the same time as my son and his entire battalion were deployed helping allies on the border of Russia protect themselves against Russian aggression. I found that highly unusual for any American, much less somebody who wanted to be president. But now what we have is, nearly 100 documented instances of ties between the Trump campaign transition and administration with Russia. Bizarre failure to be honest about meetings, and now this indication that President Trump has gone to unusual lengths to hide the content of discussions with Vladimir Putin. But the right answer is, as you suggest, it is to protect the Mueller investigation at all costs, let it get to its end, make sure that the results are made public,
are you at
so
all
then we can
concerned,
decide.
Are you at all concerned, though, that the FBI looked like it overreacted in trying to investigate a sitting president this way? I mean, this is a pretty alarming investigation, that the sitting president was acting against the interests of the United States of America.
Well, I flipped the question around, Chuck. I think it's less did the FBI overreact. I think the question is this. They had to have a very deep level of concern about this president to take this step. And that's, again, why we need to protect the Mueller investigation. And I think that's going to be a critical issue in the Judiciary Committee hearings about the Attorney General nominee. Will you guarantee to protect this investigation, and will you make sure that the American public and Congress get the results of it?
Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia. I have to let you go there. Thanks for coming on and sharing your views, sure.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. When we come back, we're going to have more on that story about Russia, the FBI, and President Trump. I'm going to talk to Michael Schmidt. He's one of the New York Times reporters who broke the story, and NBC News legal analyst Ben Wittes on why this story may be even bigger than it seems.
Ignition sequence start. 10, 9, guidance is internal. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi, I'm Bob Harper, and I recently had a heart attack. It changed my life, but I'm a survivor. After my heart attack, my doctor prescribed Brilinta. It's for people who have been hospitalized for a heart attack.
Brilinta is taken with a low-dose aspirin, no more than 100 milligrams, as it affects how well Brilinta works. Brilinta helps keep platelets from sticking together and forming a clot. In a clinical study, Brilinta worked better than Plavix.
Brilinta reduced the chance of having another heart attack or dying from one. everyone.
Don't stop taking Brilinta without talking to your doctor, since stopping it too soon increases your risk of clots in your stent, heart attack, stroke, and even death. Brilinta may cause bruising or bleeding more easily, or serious, sometimes fatal bleeding. Don't take Brilinta if you have bleeding, like stomach ulcers, a history of bleeding in the brain, or severe liver problems. Slow heart rhythm has been reported. Tell your doctor about bleeding, new or unexpected shortness of breath, any planned surgery, and all medicines you take.
If you recently had a heart attack, ask your doctor if Brilinta is right for you. My heart is worth Brilinta.
If you can't afford your medication, AstraZeneca may be able to help.
Cologuard, colon cancer screening for people 50 and older at average risk.
I'm here for an important reason, colon cancer screening. There's a bunch of places where screening wouldn't be easy, like here, or here. Nope. But here's a place you can screen for colon cancer anytime, with Cologuard, in private, without any special prep. There really is no place like home.
Cologuard is not right for everyone, so ask your doctor if it's right for you.
Welcome back. We're going to dig a little deeper into the New York Times story about President Trump and Russia. Frankly, we think it deserves an explainer. So with me now are Michael Schmidt, one of the reporters who broke the story about the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into whether Mr. Trump, as sitting president, was working as an agent for Russia. We also have Ben Wittes. He's an NBC News legal analyst and he's the editor-in-chief of the national security blog Lawfare, and he actually worked with Mr. Schmidt on this story. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. So, Michael, walk us through the piece here. The designation is a counterintelligence investigation. We've always thought of the Comey firing and the Mueller aspect as simply obstruction of justice, as sort of separate, but we're calling it counterintelligence, and it's a bit confusing. Why?
So it was a two-pronged investigation. It had a criminal aspect. Did the president break the law in trying to obstruct the investigation, interfere with it? And this other Russia question. And it's important, as you said, because our collective understanding was much narrower. It was just on obstruction. Did the president break the law there? And now we know that it was far broader. It had national security concerns. The FBI was afraid that the firing of Comey was a way to help the Russians stop the FBI from figuring out what they did in the election.
Is this still a counterintelligence investigation into whether Mr. Trump himself is acting as a Russian agent? Is that what the Mueller probe inherited?
We know the Mueller probe inherited it. We know the Mueller probe has spent an enormous amount of time trying to figure out what the president has done in office in regards to the investigation, his interference with it. They've talked to all of these White House officials. Do we know if there is still this belief and aspect that the president is working for the Russians? I can't answer that.
All right, Ben, this was all sort of the nut of this scoop by the Times was based on testimony by now a former FBI General Counsel, James Baker. And this is what he told Congress, and this was in the New York Times story, about why they viewed it as counterintelligence. He said this: not only would it be an issue of obstructing an investigation, but the obstruction itself would hurt our ability to figure out what the Russians had done, and that is what would be the threat to national security. It led you to write that the collusion question and the obstruction question are now the same thing. Collusion is obstruction and vice versa. Explain.
Well, so as Mike just described, we had sort of thought of the obstruction investigation as this kind of separate criminal investigation that arose at the time of the firing. In other words, that you had this underlying election interference investigation going on, the so-called collusion investigation. Then the president comes along and kneecaps the investigation by firing the FBI director. And a few weeks later, we learn that Bob Mueller is investigating whether that's obstruction of justice, i.e. a crime. The significance of Mike's and Adam Goldman's story is that it forces you to reimagine how the FBI understood what it was doing, which, as Mike just said, and as the quote that you read from Jim Baker reflects, was we had this investigation for national security reasons of Russian activity. Then somebody on the U.S. side, i.e. the President of the United States, took some action that kind of looks like they're trying to shut down the investigation. That raises national security concerns about whether we will be able to find out what the Russians were doing